Title: The Backyard War. Ethan Hayes had no idea that his backyard, his personal sanctuary, was about to become the center of an all-out war. It started like any other morning. He stepped outside, coffee in hand, ready to enjoy the crisp morning air. But as he reached his patio, his stomach dropped. There, on his perfectly manicured lawn, a group of children were running wild, trampling his grass. A couple sat under his favorite oak tree, spreading out a picnic as if they were in a public park. A golden retriever darted across his yard, its owner casually sipping coffee while chatting with another neighbor. Ethan blinked, trying to process the scene. Can I help you?" he called out. One of the parents barely glanced at him, giving him a lazy wave. "Oh, we're just enjoying the new park." "Great spot, by the way." Ethan frowned. New park. That's when he saw it. A bright green placard bolted into the ground near his back fence. The sign read, "Community Park, open to residents." His stomach twisted. He marched over, yanked the sign out of the dirt, and stared at it in disbelief. This had to be a mistake. He had lived in this neighborhood for years, always refusing to join the HOA because he wanted nothing to do with their rules and power trips. And now, they were claiming his backyard as a public space? His confusion quickly turned to anger. Before he could storm inside to call someone, anyone, to sort this out, a familiar grating voice rang out behind him. "Oh, good morning, Ethan. I see you've noticed our little project." He turned to see her, Karen Whitmore, the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood HOA, a woman who thrived on rules and wielded regulations like a medieval warlord. She stood at the edge of his yard, arms crossed, her smug smile firmly in place. Ethan clenched his jaw. "Karen, what the hell is this?" She sighed dramatically, as if explaining something to a child. "We had a community meeting last week, and everyone agreed your backyard would make a lovely park. Since it's been so underutilized, we decided to repurpose it for the good of the neighborhood." Ethan nearly choked on his coffee. "Underutilized? It's my private property." "Well, technically yes. But as you're not part of the HOA, there were discussions about how best to incorporate unused space for community enhancement." His hands tightened around the sign. "You can't just take my yard." Karen gave a condescending chuckle. "Oh, we're not taking it. We're just making it more accessible." "Take the sign down, Karen." "Oh, I wouldn't do that," she warned, her smile never fading. "We have approval." "From who?" "The HOA board, of course." "That's not legal." She shrugged. "If you had joined the HOA, you'd be aware of how these things work. You should really consider participating in community decisions, Ethan." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Ethan standing there gripping the sign so tightly that his knuckles turned white. That night, Ethan removed the sign and tossed it in the trash. But by the next morning, a new one had taken its place. Bigger, with sturdier posts, cemented into the ground. Karen wasn't just being a nuisance. She was actively trying to steal his land. And Ethan wasn't going to let it happen. Ethan had expected Karen to push back, but he hadn't expected her to escalate so quickly. By the afternoon, he returned home from work to find something that made his blood boil. His backyard was filled with people. Some had set up folding chairs and coolers. A group of moms lounged on his patio furniture as if they owned the place. Kids were kicking around a soccer ball, and a man was setting up a grill on his deck. Ethan stormed forward. "Excuse me, but what the hell do you think you're doing?" One of the women looked up, clearly startled. "Oh, Karen said this was a community space now." "She's wrong," Ethan snapped. "This is private property." "My property." The woman's face flushed. She glanced at the others, suddenly uncomfortable. Before she could respond, Karen appeared, flanked by two other HOA members. "Ethan," she sighed, as if he were the unreasonable one. "You're being dramatic." "Get off my land," he growled. Karen shook her head in mock disappointment. "You really should be more neighborly." Ethan forced himself to take a deep breath. He needed to handle this smartly. "Fine," he said, keeping his voice calm. "If this is all legal, I'd like to see the paperwork." Karen's smug smile faltered, just for a second. But she recovered quickly. "Oh, it's in the process of being finalized. So you don't actually have approval?" "It's a formality," she said, waving a hand dismissively. Ethan folded his arms. "Then you're trespassing." Karen's confident expression slipped. The people on his patio started packing up. Ethan pointed toward the gate. "Everyone out." There were grumbles. but the crowd dispersed. As Karen left, she smirked and said, "You can't stop progress, Ethan." That night, Ethan did some digging. He pored over property laws and zoning regulations. The HOA had no legal right to take his backyard, but there was a loophole. If he didn't use the land, they could argue it was an abandoned space and petition for control. It hit him then Karen's real plan. If she could make it seem like public land, and he didn't fight back hard enough, she might actually succeed. Over the next week, the HOA went on the offensive. First came the passive-aggressive letters. "Ethan, please consider opening your yard to the community. It would mean so much. As a homeowner, you have a responsibility to contribute to the neighborhood's well-being." Then came the threats. Failure to comply with community expectations may result in a formal review. And then, the sabotage. His backyard gate was mysteriously left open. His trash cans disappeared. His garden hose was sliced clean through. Ethan installed security cameras and caught Karen herself sneaking onto his property in the dead of night, hammering in another sign. The next morning, Ethan confronted her with the footage. She scoffed. "Oh, grow up, Ethan. You're being ridiculous." That's when he knew Karen wasn't going to stop until she got what she wanted. And that meant Ethan had to do something drastic. Ethan knew that Karen wasn't going to stop unless he made it clear that his backyard was off limits, permanently. That night, he installed new security cameras with motion sensors. He reinforced his fence and placed private property, no trespassing signs every 10 feet. But he wasn't done yet. If Karen wanted to claim his land, he'd give her a reason to hate it. The next morning, he had a delivery truck pull up to his house, unloading massive wooden beams, rolls of chicken wire, and a truckload of dirt. By the evening, Ethan had transformed the back section of his yard into a chicken coop. Yes, a chicken coop. The sound of clucking filled the air. The smell of hay and feed wafted toward Karen's house. And within days, the crowing of a newly acquired rooster greeted the neighborhood at the crack of dawn. Karen was livid. "This is outrageous," she screeched when she saw the chickens pecking at the grass. "You can't have livestock in the neighborhood." Ethan leaned casually against his porch railing. "Actually, Karen, according to county law, poultry are classified as domestic pets in rural-adjacent zones. And since I'm not in the HOA, their rules don't apply to me." Her face turned an alarming shade of red. "This isn't over," she hissed. Ethan smirked. "I sure hope not. I was thinking of adding a few goats next." Karen stormed off, and Ethan savored the moment. The war had just begun. Karen was fuming. Ethan could practically see the steam rising off of her as she stormed away, undoubtedly plotting her next move. And he was right to assume she wouldn't go down without a fight. By the next morning, Ethan woke up to find a new development, an official-looking notice tacked to his front door. HOA violation notice. Complaint. Unauthorized livestock creating noise disturbances. Required action. Immediate removal of all poultry. Deadline, 48 hours. Ethan laughed out loud. "Nice try, Karen." He crumpled the paper and tossed it in the trash. The HOA had no jurisdiction over his property. He wasn't a member. Their rules didn't apply to him. But clearly, that wasn't going to stop Karen from trying to make his life miserable. Sure enough, later that afternoon, an animal control officer showed up at his front door. "Afternoon, sir," the officer said, adjusting his sunglasses. "We got a report about an unregistered chicken coop on the property." Ethan crossed his arms. "Yeah? And who filed that report?" The officer didn't even have to answer. Ethan could see Karen peeking from behind her curtains across the street, watching like a hawk. "Well," the officer continued, "HOA complaints don't hold legal weight if the property owner isn't under their jurisdiction. But we do have to make sure the animals are being kept in humane conditions." Ethan smirked. "By all means, take a look." The officer walked around the yard, inspected the coop, the water supply, the food storage, and finally, the chickens themselves. After about 15 minutes, he returned to the front porch and shrugged. "Everything looks good here. No violations." Ethan grinned. "Great. Mind telling that to my concerned neighbor over there?" He tilted his head toward Karen's house. The officer sighed, already tired of the situation. "Have a good day, sir." As he left, Ethan saw Karen stomp her foot in frustration before vanishing back into her house. One battle won. But the war was far from over. Karen wasn't just going to roll over and accept defeat. That became abundantly clear when, The very next morning, Ethan was woken up by the sound of loud machinery. He stepped onto his porch to see a group of workers digging along the property line. His fence, the one he had reinforced just days ago, was being torn down. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Ethan shouted, storming toward the nearest worker. The man looked up, confused. "HOA ordered a fence replacement. Said the previous one wasn't up to neighborhood standards." Ethan clenched his jaw. "This is my property. The HOA has no authority here." The worker scratched his head. "You might want to take it up with them." Ethan didn't hesitate. He marched straight to Karen's house and banged on her door. She answered with a fake, syrupy smile. "Oh, Ethan. Good morning. Lovely day, isn't it?" "What did you do?" he growled. "I have no idea what you're talking about," she said innocently. "My fence, Karen. The one your crew is tearing down right now." "Oh, that," she said, waving a dismissive hand. "It was deemed unsafe. The HOA took it upon themselves to install a more aesthetically pleasing barrier." Ethan chuckled darkly. "You're paying for this, then?" Karen's expression soured. "It will be covered by community improvement funds." "Oh, so I have to pay for my own fence being torn down." Karen's smug smile returned. "It's all part of being a good neighbor." Ethan clenched his fists. He had played defense long enough. It was time to go on the offensive. That night, Ethan got to work. If Karen wanted to make his backyard public, she was about to regret it. First, he contacted a lawyer specializing in property disputes. Within hours, he had a legal cease and desist letter drafted, warning the HOA against further attempts to encroach on his land. Then, he went shopping. By the following weekend, his backyard had been transformed into something no one in the neighborhood could ignore. A massive, ugly privacy fence, 12 feet tall and reinforced with steel posts, now lined the perimeter of his property. Bright, industrial-grade floodlights were installed, activated by motion sensors, making sure no one could sneak onto his land at night. "A massive private property. Trespassers will be prosecuted," sign was nailed to the new fence. And the cherry on top? He installed a giant outdoor speaker system, set on a timer, that blasted rooster crows and farm noises every morning at sunrise. When Karen came storming over the next day, red-faced and furious, Ethan was already waiting for her on his porch with a fresh cup of coffee. "This is harassment," she shrieked, gesturing wildly at the towering fence. Ethan sipped his coffee. "No, Karen. This is me enjoying my private property." She jabbed a finger toward him. "I'll have the HOA shut this down." Ethan grinned. "Go ahead. But before you do, you might want to check your mailbox." She blinked, then marched over to her front door. Sure enough, a thick envelope sat in her mailbox, courtesy of Ethan's lawyer. Ethan watched as she opened it, her expression shifting from anger to shock to sheer frustration as she read the legal notice. This is ridiculous," she stammered. "No, Karen," Ethan said, smirking. "This is legally binding." For the first time since their feud began, Karen had no words. Ethan leaned back in his chair, letting the sweet, victorious sound of morning roosters echo through the neighborhood. The war wasn't over, but Ethan had just won a major battle. Karen was quiet for a few days after receiving the legal notice. Too quiet. Ethan knew she wasn't done, not by a long shot. He could feel it, like the calm before a storm. Then it happened. One evening, just as Ethan was settling down with a beer on his porch, a white sedan with official government markings pulled up in front of his house. A man in a county inspector's uniform stepped out, clipboard in hand. Karen appeared almost instantly, lurking on her front lawn with an all-too-pleased smile. Ethan sighed. Here we go again. The inspector approached, clearing his throat. "Good evening, sir. We've received a complaint about an environmental hazard on your property." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "And what now?" The inspector flipped through his paperwork. "The report states that you've created a nuisance environment with excessive noise pollution, artificial lighting disrupting the local ecosystem, and an improperly zoned livestock area." Ethan smirked, glancing over at Karen. "Let me guess. This complaint came from a concerned neighbor?" The inspector hesitated. "We don't disclose complainants." Ethan chuckled. "Sure you don't." He led the inspector through the backyard, letting him check the coop, the fence, the lights, everything. After a thorough review, the inspector sighed and put away his clipboard. "There's nothing here violating county regulations," he admitted. "The noise levels aren't extreme. The lighting is within residential zoning guidelines, and the livestock falls under small-scale domestic animal allowances. Karen's face fell. Ethan grinned. So, we're done here? The inspector nodded. Yep. Just another neighbor dispute, it seems. Karen stormed back into her house without a word. Another win for Ethan. Karen had tried legal routes. She had tried bureaucratic loopholes. Now, she was going to resort to something even prettier. Over the next week, Ethan started noticing small, irritating acts of sabotage. His garbage bins were mysteriously overturned in the mornings. His mail went missing. His car tires were mysteriously low on air. And, most annoyingly, someone had started leaving HOA violation notices on his fence, even thought they held no authority over his property. Ethan installed new security cameras. It didn't take long before he caught Karen on video, sneaking onto his property late at night to pin yet another fake violation notice onto his fence. The next morning, Ethan took a copy of the footage and emailed it to his lawyer. By the end of the day, Karen received a cease and desist order. The following morning, she received a personal trespassing complaint filed against her. That afternoon, she was served with legal documents on her front porch. By nightfall, Karen's porch light was off, and her curtains were drawn. For the first time in years, the neighborhood was silent. Days passed, then a week, then two. Karen was no longer patrolling the neighborhood with her clipboard. No more HOA letters arrived at Ethan's doorstep. And, best of all, no more attempts were made to claim his backyard. Then, the inevitable happened. One morning, as Ethan sipped his coffee on his porch, a large moving truck pulled up in front of Karen's house. Jim, Ethan's neighbor from down the street, wandered over, hands in his pockets. Well, I'll be damned. She's really leaving. Ethan grinned. Guess she finally got tired of losing. They watched as boxes were loaded into the truck, Karen barking orders at the movers. Her face was set in a tight, bitter frown. She avoided eye contact with everyone. As the last box was packed, she climbed into her car and slammed the door. But just before she pulled away, her gaze met Ethan's. For a second, she looked like she wanted to say something, one final parting shot. But instead, she gritted her teeth, put the car in drive, and sped off without another word. Jim clapped Ethan on the back. Looks like you won, buddy. Ethan chuckled. Yeah, and I didn't even have to build a swamp. With Karen gone, the neighborhood felt lighter. The HOA, desperate to save face, left Ethan alone. No more letters. No more surprise inspections. No more nonsense. His backyard remained his, just as it should have been all along. And as Ethan leaned back in his chair, taking in the peaceful morning air, he smiled. The war was over. And he had won.